In the summer of 1922, deep in the red clay heart of Alabama, the town of Briarwood stood like a quiet hymn of black resilience. Founded by freedmen after the Civil War, it was a place where families built homes out of hope, where fields whispered with the promise of harvest, and where each sunrise felt like a small victory carved out of a hostile world. Yet beneath that calm surface lay a gathering storm, one born from envy, resentment, and a violent desire to erase what black hands had built. At the center of this tension stood Thomas Avery, a soft-spoken carpenter whose steady hands crafted everything from cradles to church pews. But in that year, as the Klan's power swelled like a dark tide, Thomas would become far more than a craftsman. He would become the keeper of Briarwood's memory, its witness, its protector, its unbroken flame. The morning began with a strange stillness, the kind that made even the birds quiet, as if the land itself sensed what was approaching. Thomas stepped out of his workshop, brushing sawdust from his sleeves, and noticed the way the sunlight cut through the pine trees in sharp, uneasy stripes. Word had been circulating for weeks that the Klan had set its eyes on Briarwood, angered by its success, its unity, and the simple fact that it thrived without white oversight. Thomas felt that truth settling on his shoulders like the weight of an invisible hand. As he looked down the main road, he could see neighbors, moving cautiously, offering nods that carried more worry than greeting. Each step he took toward the town square seemed to echo louder than the last, as if time itself were stretching thin. Briarwood had survived droughts, storms, and the bitterness of those who resented its existence, but this threat was different. It moved in shadows, wore a hood, and carried fire in its fists. Inside the general store, the air smelled of flour, kerosene, and unspoken fear. Mrs. Lila Dorsey, who had run the shop for decades, kept glancing at the window as she packed sugar into brown paper bags. "They're circling again," she murmured, her voice low, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Thomas nodded, remembering the distant hoofbeats he'd heard the night before, a slow, deliberate rhythm that crawled beneath the skin. The men of the town had met quietly in the church basement, speaking in whispers about preparing barricades, hiding the children, and guarding the well. But even in their planning, there was a heavy truth no one could ignore. The Klan didn't just want to scare Briarwood, they wanted to wipe it from the map. Thomas picked up a crate of nails, feeling the cold metal bite into his palms. "We build," he said softly, almost to himself. "We hold. That's what we've always done." Yet beneath his determination, a quiet dread stirred like a wind rising before a storm. As Thomas stepped outside, he noticed a thin column of dust rising on the distant road, the kind made not by wind, but by wheels. The sun caught the edges of it, turning it into a pale ribbon twisting toward the town. A hush fell over the street as others saw it too. Doors slowly closed, curtains shifted, mothers pulled their children close. Thomas felt his pulse quicken, though he forced his breath to remain steady. He walked to the edge of the street, his boots crunching against the dry earth, and watched the dust swell into a larger cloud. 3 Model T cars emerged like dark omens, moving with a slow and deliberate confidence. Though still distant, their intent was unmistakable. Briarwood had been measured, judged, and now marked. Thomas felt the heat of the day deepen around him, yet a coldness crept along his spine. The first move had been made, not with words, but with arrival, and he knew that the arrival of men who hid their faces always meant the same thing. The night ahead would demand courage beyond fear. The cars rolled to a stop at the far end of Briarwood's main road, their engines cutting off one by one until the entire town was swallowed in an uncanny silence. Thomas watched from behind a wagon, his breath steady but shallow, as the doors opened and the men emerged. 4 from the first vehicle, 5 from the second, and 3 from the last. Their faces were exposed for now, but their intentions were not. Their hats were pulled low, their shirts crisp, their boots polished in a way that made the dust cling resentfully to the leather. They surveyed the town with the cold precision of surveyors, marking land they believed already theirs. Thomas felt a slow burn rising within him, the kind of heat that came not from anger alone, but from generations of endurance braided into the bone. The men walked with the ease of those who had never been challenged, never been denied. But Briarwood had not been built on permission. It had been built on survival, on the tireless conviction that life must be claimed even where it is unwelcome. From the doorway of the barber shop, old Mr. Holloway stepped forward, wiping his hands on a worn cloth, his eyes sharp despite his years. He gave Thomas a firm nod, the kind that spoke entire sentences without a single word. Together they watched the strangers stand in a loose semicircle, murmuring among themselves. One of them pointed toward the church steeple, another toward the schoolhouse that the town had rebuilt twice after mysterious fires. The leader, a tall man with a stiff jaw and eyes like dull steel, pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Even from a distance, Thomas recognized the gesture. It wasn't a notice. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. The man read aloud, though only the wind carried pieces of his voice toward them. Illegitimate settlement, failure to pay county obligations, land reassigned. The lies came wrapped in the language of legality, but the truth lay bare beneath it. They intended to uproot Briarwood, with pen and fire alike. A small crowd of townspeople formed behind Thomas, their steps hesitant but resolute. Mothers held infants tight, elders leaned on canes carved from trees that had watched wars pass, and young men stood with shoulders squared, their fear forged into a hard, trembling determination. Thomas could feel their presence behind him like a rising tide, steady and immense. The steel-eyed man finished reading his lies and folded the paper with deliberate slowness, as though expecting applause. Instead, Briarwood answered with silence, a silence so deep it pressed against the air like a warning. Thomas stepped forward, the earth firm beneath his boots. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let the anger crack through. Instead, he spoke with the calm of someone who knew the truth was older and stronger than any threat. "This town stands," he said, "and we stand with it." The steel-eyed man's smirk faltered, if only for a breath. The line had been drawn. Night settled over Briarwood like a heavy curtain, thick with humidity and the weight of unspoken dread. Lanterns glowed behind shuttered windows, each beam of light a trembling heartbeat in the dark. Thomas sat in the church basement with 24 others. The room filled with the low murmur of anxious voices and the faint scent of pine tar dripping from freshly made torches. Pastor Green stood at the center, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes carrying the worn wisdom of a man who had buried too many sons to illusions of peace. "They will return," he said quietly, his voice echoing along the wooden beams overhead. "Not to speak, not to threaten, but to erase." A chill swept through the room, though the night outside remained warm. Thomas felt it settle against his spine, a reminder that the clan didn't strike in daylight. They preferred the hour when fear was most tender, when a knock at the door could splinter the soul. The men leaned over a rough wooden table where a map of Briarwood lay drawn in charcoal. The homes along the creek, the cotton fields stretching toward the ridge, the schoolhouse rebuilt plank by plank, the church that had survived more storms than any building its size had right to. Thomas traced the ridgeline with his fingertip, thinking of how the sound traveled there, how footsteps carried like whispers and how fires lit in the valley painted the sky with orange scars. They spoke of watch schedules, escape routes, for children, signals to warn if riders approached. But beneath these plans lay a deeper ache. Briarwood had been founded to escape burning crosses, to escape the night riders, and now The past had circled back like a wolf that never forgot the scent. Thomas looked around the room, at fathers gripping lanterns, at mothers clutching photographs, and wondered how many more battles a people could fight before the land itself remembered their footsteps as grief. When the meeting ended, Thomas stepped outside into the open night, the moon hanging low like a pale coin pressed against the sky. The cicadas buzzed in a restless chorus, drowning out the distant hum of the river. He walked the road slowly, studying the shadows beneath the trees, the faint glow of windows where families prayed behind locked doors. It struck him then that Briarwood wasn't just a town. It was a pulse, a living testament to a defiant dream passed from calloused hands to trembling ones. He paused, near the well, listening to the water echo in its stone throat, and felt the stirring of something fierce and unyielding rise within him. Whatever came in the hours ahead, whatever fire they brought, Briarwood would not face it bowed. And as Thomas lifted his gaze toward the ridge, a thin line of torchlight flickered in the trees, too distant to see clearly, but close enough to confirm what he already knew. The night had begun its closing circle. The hours crept forward with a slow, suffocating stillness, the kind that makes even the stars hold their breath. Thomas walked the outer edge of town with a lantern hooded to keep the flame dim, the soft glow barely touching the dirt beneath his boots. Every rustle from the thickets, every distant crack of a branch felt like the world whispering a warning in a language older than fear. As he approached the Avery homestead, he could see his sister Miriam sitting on the porch, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of cooling tea. Her eyes lifted when he approached, weary yet resolved. "They'll come tonight," she said, her voice low. "I felt it in the fields today, the way the wind moved strange." Thomas nodded because he had felt it too, that shifting in the air that comes when a storm gathers unseen. The night was no longer merely dark, it was expectant, coiled, waiting. Inside the small wooden house, the scent of warm cornbread lingered, refusing to yield to the bitterness of fear. Miriam led Thomas to the back room where their mother slept beneath a quilt, stitched with stories, blue squares for births, red for losses, white for the days when nothing but hope held the family together. Thomas knelt beside her, brushing a hand over her weathered fingers. She stirred slightly, whispering his name through a half-dream. "You watch over them," she murmured. "Our people. Too many running, not enough standing." Her words settled into him like an ember pressed into cloth, smoldering into resolve. He rose slowly, planting a kiss on her forehead, then stepped back into the main room, where his nephews sat with slingshots clutched tight, trying to look brave. Thomas bent low, speaking softly. "Your job is to stay hidden, stay quiet, and stay alive." They nodded, wide-eyed, understanding far more than children ever should. When Thomas returned outside, the moon had slipped behind a veil of drifting clouds, dimming the world into a hushed grey. Across town, lanterns flickered as guards switched shifts, their silhouettes crossing like shadows, stitching the night together. A distant dog barked, then another, their cries echoing in uneasy harmony. Thomas placed a hand against the rough bark of the old pecan tree near the road and closed his eyes. He pictured the generations before him, men who had cut through brambles to build homes, women who had sung freedom into existence even when the world refused to hear it. Briarwood was not a place of chance. It was a promise carved into the land, and as he opened his eyes, he saw it, a faint glint from the ridge, like moonlight catching steel. Then another and another. The riders had not yet approached, but they were there, gathering like a tide, preparing to break. The night shifted. The waiting was over. The first sound came soft and slow, a rhythm that curled into the air like a whisper testing the doorframe of the night. hooves, many of them, moving in measured unison along the northern road. Thomas straightened, lantern dimmed, breath controlled. From the far end of Briarwood, men signaled with brief flickers of light, the coded warnings they had practiced now pulsing like the heartbeat of the town itself. Miriam stepped outside again, her face pale but steady. "It's happening," she said, clutching the shawl around her shoulders. Thomas motioned her inside, then jogged toward the town square, his boots hitting the earth with purpose. The hooves grew louder, their cadence sure and merciless. The riders no longer hid their presence. They wanted Briarwood to hear them coming, to tremble at the sound. But the town did not tremble. Doors remained shut, lamps went dark. A silence rose to meet the approaching threat, a silence woven not from fear, but from unity. As Thomas reached the square, he saw Pastor Green standing with a lantern at his feet, its flame pared down to the smallest flicker. Several men formed a line beside him, farmers, carpenters, field hands, each holding tools that had shaped their lives, but might, before dawn, defend them as well. Thomas took his place among them, feeling the ground vibrate beneath the approaching column of horses. He could see their silhouettes now, tall, imposing figures shrouded in white robes that billowed in the night wind. Their torches were unlit for the moment, but their intent burned bright enough to illuminate the darkness. The leader raised a megaphone, its metal catching the faint glow from the moon. His voice cut through the stillness with cruel clarity. "Briarwood, you have been warned. Stand down or be swept aside." The words echoed over the quiet homes, over the fields that had fed generations. Thomas felt his jaw tighten. This was no warning. It was a reckoning. For a long moment, no one moved. The riders halted at the edge of the square, their horses snorting clouds of pale breath into the air. The leader waited for fear to break the silence, but fear did not speak. Instead, Pastor Green stepped forward, his lantern at his feet casting a small halo around him. His voice rose steady and unshaken. "This town is not yours to threaten. It was built by hands stronger than hate, and it will stand long after your fires burn out." The riders shifted, taken aback that a black man dared answer them without trembling. Thomas felt the charge in the air sharpen, like the moment before lightning splits the sky. Somewhere behind him, a child cried. Softly, quickly hushed. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, eyes narrowing behind the slit of his hood. "Then we begin," he said. And with a sharp gesture, the first torch struck flint. The torch flared to life with a violent hiss, the fire snapping upward as if hungry for the oxygen of fear. But Briarwood did not cower. The men in the square stood firm, their silhouettes carved in quiet defiance against the wavering light. Thomas felt the heat lick at the air as more torches ignited, each one a small sun, burning with the arrogance of men who believed the night belonged to them. The riders began to form a circle around the square, their horses pawing the earth, their white robes rippling like ghosts, animated by hatred. The leader raised his torch high, its flame painting his hood in shifting orange shadows. "You will leave," he declared, "or we will cleanse this place of your stain." His voice carried with the confidence of someone accustomed to obedience. Yet Briarwood's stillness answered him like a wall, unmovable, unyielding. The firelight reflected in Thomas's eyes not as fear, but as resolve, sharpened by the memory of every injustice endured. Suddenly, a crack echoed through the night. Not gunfire, but the sharp report of timber breaking. One of the riders had struck the schoolhouse signpost with the butt of his torch, sending splinters scattering across the dirt. The message was clear. They would not merely threaten, they would dismantle. Thomas stepped forward instinctively, but Pastor Green placed a steady hand on his arm. "Not yet," he murmured. "The night is testing us." The riders jeered, emboldened by the sound of their own destruction. A torch struck the ground near the church steps, embers scattering like malicious sparks. The wood caught briefly before dying in the damp earth, a small mercy from the night itself. Thomas felt his heartbeat thrum like a drum of ancient warning. His mind raced, not with panic, but with calculation. The ridge beyond the tree line, the water buckets lined behind the church, the hidden trenches dug near the creek, all of it forming a quiet map of resistance etched into his thoughts. Then the riders made their move. 3 of them dismounted at once, stepping toward the nearest homes with torches raised. That was the moment Briarwood could no longer remain still. From the shadows between houses, women emerged carrying buckets of well water. From behind, wagons. Men stepped forward gripping shovels, rakes, and heavy tools. They moved not as a mob, but as a single body, rehearsed by years of necessity. Thomas rushed toward the advancing riders, intercepting the first torch as it swung downward. He seized the man's wrist, the firelight revealing startled eyes behind the hood's slit. "Not here," Thomas growled, his voice low as the rumble of distant thunder. The man yanked back, stumbling, and dropped the torch which Thomas stamped out. Beneath his boot, the square erupted into motion, not chaos but a dance of resistance. Briarwood had drawn its line, and the night felt it shift. The riders recoiled at the sudden wall of defiance, their earlier certainty dissolving into agitation. Horses sidestepped nervously, hooves clattering against the hard-packed dirt as the circle broke. The leader barked orders, his voice cracking with an edge of disbelief. This was not the trembling, silent community they had expected. This was something else, something they had not prepared for. As Thomas stood in the glow of dying embers, he felt Briarwood rise behind him like a tide. Men tightening their grips on makeshift weapons, women passing water from hand to hand with the practiced discipline of those who had long known danger. Pastor Green moved through the crowd with a lantern, his presence a steadying force. "Hold the line," he called, not with desperation, but with the quiet power of a man who understood that endurance itself could be a weapon. The riders hesitated, and for the first time that night, doubt flickered among their ranks. The leader spurred his horse forward, the animal snorting as if refusing the command. He thrust his torch toward the nearest home, determined to reclaim control through flame. But before the fire could find its mark, a stream of water arced through the air, dousing the torch and soaking the rider's robe. Gasps rippled through the square at the boldness of the act. It was Miriam, standing with her bucket raised, her eyes burning with righteous defiance. For a heartbeat, time held still. Then the rider wheeled his horse toward her in fury. Thomas lunged before the horse could reach her, planting himself between them, his boots firmly rooted in the dirt. The horse reared and the rider cursed, swinging the wet torch like a club. Thomas caught the blow on his forearm, pain igniting like a spark beneath the skin, yet he did not yield. Around them, the crowd surged, voices rising in a chorus of resistance older than the night. The confrontation fractured the riders' control. Some pulled back, shaken by the town's unity. Others pressed forward recklessly, their anger growing faster than their courage. The square became a battlefield of restraint, Briarwood fighting with hands that refused to kill, and the riders fighting with the desperation of men whose authority was slipping through their fingers. A torch flew, landing near the well, but was stamped out instantly. Another rider swung a rope like a threat, only to have it seized and yanked from his grip by 2 elders standing shoulder to shoulder. Thomas felt the energy shift, the way a storm shifts when the wind begins to change direction. The riders had intended to break the town's spirit, but instead they had awakened something they could not extinguish. Briarwood was no longer defending homes, it was defending history, and the night trembled beneath the weight of that truth. The night deepened into a heavy, pulsing darkness as the riders regrouped on the far side of the square. Their torches flickered uncertainly, casting long, distorted shadows that twisted across the dirt like serpents losing their shape. A few of the men dismounted again, this time with a frantic haste, as if trying to reclaim the dominance slipping through their fingers. Thomas watched their movements closely, sensing a wildness in them, a volatility born not of confidence, but of humiliation. The leader snapped orders in sharp fragments, his voice rising with each command, revealing cracks in the authority he once wielded with ease. Briarwood stood in a silent line behind Thomas, a wall of breath and resolve. The women tightened their grip on their buckets, the men shifted their weight with quiet readiness, and the children huddled in doorways, their eyes wide, witnessing the moment when fear began to flee from the ones who had carried it for generations. Then came the sound that split the tension in two, the shrill, desperate neigh of a horse as someone in the back ranks of the riders lost control of their animal. The creature reared violently, kicking up earth, knocking another rider sideways. The small eruption of chaos rippled outward, and for a moment the white robes looked less like symbols of terror and more like a tangle of confused men trapped in their own aggression. Thomas saw opportunity flicker like a spark in dry grass. He stepped forward, voice firm but calm, rising above the noise. "Leave," he said. "Your fire has no place here." The words carried a strange weight, as if lifted by every ancestor who had endured nights far darker than this one. The leader pulled his horse around, glaring through the slit of his hood, anger trembling through his posture. But even he could not ignore the faltering will of his men, who now shifted uneasily at the sight of their unity dissolving under the pressure of Briarwood's unwavering stance. A low rumble of voices grew from the riders' ranks, arguments breaking out, blame tossed like stones in the dark. One man pointed toward the forest edge, urging retreat. Another insisted they press forward and reclaim some semblance of dominance. The leader barked at them to quiet down, but his command carried less force than before. Meanwhile, the townspeople stood unbroken, a quiet, immovable presence illuminated by the trembling torchlight. Thomas felt the change in the air, a subtle shift of power from those who threatened destruction to those who protected life. Miriam stepped up beside him, her breath steady, her shoulders squared. "They came expecting a graveyard," she murmured, "but they found a fortress." Her voice, though soft, echoed like truth spoken into the marrow of the night. The riders sensed it too, the unraveling certainty, the creeping fear that perhaps this town, this forgotten place on the map, was not theirs to conquer after all. The leader, refusing to yield to the rising dissent among his men, thrust his torch into the air once more. The flames sputtered, strained by the damp wind, as though the night itself resisted him. "This is your last chance," he roared, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. But Briarwood answered with silence, a silence so firm it felt like stone beneath the feet. Not a single person stepped back. Not one bowed their head. Thomas could feel the unity behind him like a living force pressing forward, steady and resolute. The leader's grip tightened on the torch, his knuckles whitening. Behind the hood's slit, Thomas imagined his eyes darting, searching for the fear that was supposed to be there, and finding instead a wall of unbroken faces. The moment stretched, long and taut, as if the night itself waited for the truth to declare itself. The riders had power in numbers, in fire, in reputation, but Briarwood held something older, something unyielding, a collective refusal to disappear. Frustration overtook the leader, and with a guttural cry he hurled the torch toward the porch of the Avery home. Gasps filled the air. But they were not the gasps of fear he expected. Before the torch could strike the wood, a bucket of water arced through the air in a perfect, practiced motion. It hit the flame dead on, extinguishing it with a hiss that cut through the night like a triumphant whisper. The crowd parted just enough for Thomas to see who had thrown it, young Isaiah Turner, barely 16, his hands still trembling from the force of the motion. A ripple of awe spread through the townspeople, not because he had saved the house, but because he had dared. The leader stared at the smoking torch in disbelief, his authority shrinking with every droplet that dripped from the porch boards. One of the riders muttered something harsh, and another shifted nervously, gripping his reins tighter. For the first time, fear didn't belong to Briarwood, it belonged to the men who brought it. Sensing the unraveling of their mission, several riders turned their horses slightly, angling toward the road as though contemplating retreat. The leader noticed and snapped at them to hold formation, but his command rang hollow, stripped of conviction. The horses, too, sensed the tension, ears twitching, muscles rippling, hooves pawing the ground with restless uncertainty. Thomas stepped forward again, his shadow long across the square. "You want us gone," he said, his voice calm but echoing like a distant drum. "But we are rooted deeper than any fear you carry. You can burn our boards, but not our purpose. You can threaten our homes, but not our belonging." The words were not poetic. They were truth spoken from a place beyond rhetoric. A hush fell, thick and reverent. Even the riders paused, their torches held mid-air, as though acknowledging a force they could not name. For the first time, the night tipped in Briarwood's favor. A charged stillness settled over the square, as if the night itself held its breath between two forces waiting to collide. The leader, realizing his authority was slipping through his fingers, lifted his torch in one final attempt to rally the men around him. But at that exact moment, a sudden gust swept across Briarwood, bending the flames sideways in a sharp, wavering arc. Dust rose in restless spirals, drifting between the riders and the townspeople like a veil stirred by unseen hands. Horses snorted uneasily, their hooves scraping the dirt in agitated half-steps. Thomas felt the wind brush his face, carrying with it a low whisper that reminded him of hymns sung in fields long before he was born. It felt as if the ancestors themselves had exhaled into the night, recognizing that this moment demanded more than courage. It demanded memory. The leader barked commands into the wind, but his words scattered before reaching the edges of the square. "Move! Advance!" he shouted, yet even the men closest to him hesitated, gripping reins that trembled with the nerves of the animals beneath them. Some glanced nervously toward the tree line, others toward the darkened homes that stood like guardians over the families inside. Thomas stepped forward, not with aggression, but with purpose. The firelight caught the angles of his face, and the quiet certainty in his eyes seemed to grow taller than the flames. "The night isn't your ally," he said, his voice cutting through the wind, "and it never will be." The leader stiffened, as if unsure whether the challenge came from Thomas alone or from the shifting weight of the night itself. For the first time, his confidence faltered. Then a young rider, no older than 20, broke ranks. "Enough," he said, his voice shaking. "This ain't right." The leader snapped toward him with vicious fury, but the young man had already turned his horse toward the open road, his robe trailing behind him like a surrendering banner. Another rider followed, then a third. The unraveling spread quickly, small movements at first, then a clear fracture splitting the group apart. The leader shouted insults into the darkness, but the words fell flat, powerless against the sight of his men retreating. Thomas watched them go, not with triumph, but with a solemn awareness that this night had revealed a deeper truth. Hatred loses certainty when it meets a wall that does not break. Fear had changed direction, and the riders, once so sure of their dominance, now found themselves shrinking from a town they had expected to erase. With half his men already disappearing into the darkness behind him, the leader remained in the square, shoulders heaving with breath he could no longer steady. His torch flickered in his grip, casting uneven flashes across the hood that hid his expression, but not his frustration. You think this is victory? He spat, his voice frayed at the edges. This isn't over, not by a long shot. But no one answered. The townspeople stood motionless, forming a quiet battalion of mothers, fathers, elders and children who had already endured more fear than one lifetime deserved. Pastor Green stepped forward, lantern unlit in his hand, holding it like a symbol of faith that needed no flame. "Leave this place," he said calmly, "and let this be the last night you try to bury what God himself has raised." The leader's posture wavered, caught between rage and a dawning realization that he stood alone. The silence deepened until even the insects seemed to still their wings. The leader tugged sharply at his horse's reins, but the animal reared in resistance, snorting hot breath into the air. He released his torch to regain control, letting it fall to the ground where it smoldered weakly before the last ember faded. Thomas stepped forward again, not with challenge, but with a presence that carried the weight of every family behind him. "There is nothing left for you here," he said, voice steady as stone. "Your fire won't break us. Your hatred won't erase us." The leader looked around the square, at the homes still standing, at the resolute faces, at the unity he had failed to shatter. And in that quiet realization, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly. The authority he thought he commanded had dissolved into the night. He turned his horse at last, defeated but unwilling to admit it aloud. The few remaining riders fell in behind him, their retreat a thin, faltering line against the moonlit road. As they disappeared into the distance, a profound stillness washed over Briarwood. Not the stillness of fear, but the stillness that follows deliverance. No one cheered, no one spoke. Instead, families drew close, their breaths trembling with the weight of survival. Thomas closed his eyes and let the moment imprint itself on his spirit, the sound of retreating hooves, the smell of damp earth, the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a wind that had chosen its side. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Miriam leaning against the well post, her face a mixture of exhaustion and fragile relief. "Will they come back?" she asked softly. Thomas looked toward the road where the darkness had swallowed their enemies. "Maybe," he said. "But tonight, we stood." Dawn broke slowly over Briarwood, washing the battered square in a pale gold that felt almost unreal after the long, breathless darkness. The air carried the scent of damp earth and lingering smoke, but also the unmistakable fragrance of morning, a reminder that night, no matter how merciless, was never permanent. Thomas stood at the edge of the road, watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the rooftops the riders had failed to burn. Neighbors emerged quietly from their homes, rubbing weary eyes, holding children close, offering soft greetings that trembled with equal parts relief and disbelief. The oldest elders walked the square with careful steps, touching fence posts, door frames, the well, each gesture a silent inventory of miracles. Briarwood had been tested, threatened, nearly swallowed, but it stood. And the rising sun seemed to rest its full warmth upon the town, as if blessing its survival. Pastor Green gathered the community beneath the church's front steps, the boards still damp from the water buckets that had protected them mere hours. Earlier, his voice, usually firm and commanding from the pulpit, carried a gentler hum this morning. "We witnessed something sacred last night," he said. "Not the fall of our enemies, but the rising of ourselves." Heads lowered, not in shame or exhaustion, but in reverence. Mothers held their children closer, recognizing that their survival was more than chance. It was the work of many hands, seen and unseen. Thomas looked around at the faces that had stood beside him, men who had quietly built barricades, women who had thrown water with unyielding aim, elders who had refused to be erased. The unity that had formed in the shadows still pulsed in the daylight, strong as a heartbeat. Briarwood wasn't merely alive, it was awakened. As the morning stretched into midday, the people of Briarwood began repairing the small damages the riders had left behind, replacing a broken post here, sweeping scattered dirt there, righting lanterns that had fallen overnight. Children played, near the well again, laughter cautious at first, but growing freer as the hours passed. Miriam approached Thomas, her eyes softer than they had been in weeks. "You think they'll tell the world what happened here?" she asked. Thomas paused, glancing at the horizon where the riders had vanished. "Maybe," he said, "but even if they don't, we will." He looked back at the square, the place where fear had tried to root itself, and where courage had taken deeper soil instead. Briarwood had not been erased. It had been written into history by the very people meant to disappear, and as the sun climbed higher, lighting the red Alabama earth with a steady glow, Thomas knew one truth above all: the world would change slowly, but this town had already changed forever.